Hi, and welcome to Rule of Carnage. I'm Glenn Ford, and I'm here talking to Mike Hutchinson
That's my name.
About designing better miniatures games. Today, we're going to talk about deployment, not just the deployment phase of maybe troops and units, but also terrain deployment, table setup, the bits and pieces that you have to go through at the start of a game to get people having stuff on the table to play with. It can be a tricky area to write because you're front loading a lot of information, and we'll talk about front loading a little bit. And it's also one of the places where you have to set out a lot of your terms, get through a lot of jargon early on, stop referring to things as miniatures or models or stuff or things. So we'll talk a little bit about that in this first video. And then in the second video, or if you're listening on the podcast, it will run straight through. We're going to try and go a little bit into maybe why it is that some of the games that we've written, certainly games like A Billion Suns and Gaslands, have so completely avoided a traditional deployment phase or a deployment zone. What some of the pros and cons of doing that are, and why some of those decisions were made. So we'll open up. I think possibly the first thing to talk about with deployment is terrain deployment, setting up a table, literally getting a play space in on the table for people to start engaging with. And it's a big area because people have a huge range of terrain. There needs to be a lot of definition. Now, I know, Mike, that in Gaslands, there's obviously setting up the racetracks. There's a certain amount of defining of terrain deployment that needed to be done there. How do you go about explaining to someone how to set up a table from nothing? How do you present it to somebody who maybe has never considered setting up their own playing surface before?
I think it depends quite a lot on the game's audience to begin with. So I think if you, in terms of thinking about who your game is for, if you're aiming for a more experienced player, or you're assuming a lot more experience with miniature war games with your rule set, or you're designing something that's intended to be as sort of as new player friendly as possible, feels like there's a lot of potential shortcutting that you can do if you are assuming some level of experience, because certainly for me, setting up terrain and the layout of the tables has sort of been, I don't know, a kind of instinct I've learned over many years, but I don't really know. I don't really know what it is that I do. I just sort of shuffle things around, and then I learned some other things from kind of the tournament war game scene a bit as people tried to pay more attention to it. But to be honest with you, the way that I do it in, for example, Gaslands is pretty cheaty, because I just say quite descriptively, I just say, set up the debris of a broken wasteland. And that's a total cop-out, because it essentially says, set something up, play your first game, maybe you have a good time and you do that again, maybe you have a bad time and try a different deployment of terrain if you figure out that was the reason for it.
And I think that's one of the things about the terrain deployment, the table setup, that's so interesting, is that a bad table setup can absolutely kill a game experience. It can totally ruin it. And yet many.
It's so right, because I only played one game of Warhammer 40,000 in the 6th edition of that game, because I'd come back to the hobby. I'd finished a let's call it a fully painted Tyranid army. It was basically sprayed black and then dry brushed, but
minimum 3 colors.
I painted the eyes white and the teeth white. The table was almost blank. I put my Tyranids down on the table. The towels were put on the other side. I took all my Tyranids off, and I never played the game again. I just didn't have anything reserved. And of course, miniature skirmish games tend to thrive on having lots of line of sight blocking terrain.
Mm.
And there are some rule systems which are quite explicit about how much there should be, and they try and define terms such as, break the table into 4 quarters and make sure there's more than 3 pieces of terrain in each quarter, and each piece of terrain should be 50 mil square or larger, and so on and so forth, which of course is all basically bobbins, because it depends what pieces of polystyrene you've cut out and stuck onto cardboard and painted grey that you happen to have around. But at least it gives the player a sort of idea in their mind of what that might look like. Whereas my cheaty Gaslands one of just like set up a desert wasteland is it's sort of speaking to the cinematic or the narrative element of terrain setup, which feels honest and in some way usable, but at the same time, like, how do you write the terrain setup rules for a science fiction combat game that's intended to be used across any number of entirely fantastical, death worlds and space stations and industrial complexes and underground and overground? How do you ensure a fair game with the rules that you write in that paragraph?
Yeah, I think once or twice I've sat down to write a sort of comprehensive set of rules for setting up terrain, for setting up a table for a given system, and it's absolutely soul crushing. It's borderline impossible to sort of say, okay,
lost procedural Warhammer setup
but
rules.
it is because once you start saying, okay, buildings can't be within a certain distance of each other, or they've got to be a certain size, or they've got to allow for this, or got to allow for that, or once I sort of attempted a system where you say, get your terrain, mush it into a quarter of the table, so long as it doesn't feel more than that, that's the right amount of terrain, then start spreading. And I don't know, do you think that maybe there's a little bit of cheating because I totally agree with you. A lot of miniatures games designs basically go, you'll get the hang of it, play a few games, you'll get the feel for it, you'll put in too many woods in your first game, not enough hills, and then you'll play a few, and then eventually, whenever I go to a club or a tournament, you see pretty much the same sets of terrain for most game systems. Like if you go to a Warhammer tournament, you'll see similar sets of terrain for your club because everyone knows what is fair. And is it weird that everyone knows that and everyone's built those heuristics for that, but nobody's made an attempt to write it down particularly?
I think no, I don't think it's weird, and I think that's because it would be probably too restrictive and or frustrating to execute as a player. You'd read through those things and it would be like, well, I know what I want. And I think that after a few, like, it doesn't take that many times of playing games for you to sort of figure out what you like the look of, and that probably matters almost as much as what the game is designed to play across. I think what I will say is I think it's particularly strong to feature images of what the table should look like as part of your rules. This is actually something that I realizing now I've completely failed to deliver in any of my products. But a couple of really interesting examples recently are the way that Adeptus Titanicus opens the rule book has this beautifully sort of modeled industrial area, but it's not so complicated that you can't imagine building it for yourself, even though it's all all nicely sculpted and everything. But it sort of describes, oh, I'm going to need some things about this high and some things about this high, and oh, it looks like there's quite a lot of open space, and then you realize there's large bases in play. And another really interesting example is Relic Blade, Sean Sutter's game, where there is I think there's an image of it in real terms as well, but he's drawn a very beautiful illustration of what kind of like the fantasy game board that you would draw in a notebook and go, oh, one day I'm going to learn how to make this. And so that really, like, that says, wow, it's really packed in, and it's more like playing over a Games Workshop diorama than it is playing on a normal table. And the third example I think is really interesting on this is Carnival, which in its second edition has a set of MDF terrain that you can actually buy from TT Combat, who sell the game these days. And in the front of that book, there's a very clearly photographed city of Venice. And in that, it seems like it almost matters more than any game, because that game sort of relies on you having canals and water and stuff that you just genuinely wouldn't normally have in a game.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. I think Carnival's a great example because the terrain is so central to that game, and there's so much of the and it's a great game, but so much of it's about running across balconies and jumping from awning to awning and running along walls, and as you say, there's all the canals and the rules for that.
It's interesting actually, because one of the other, I know I bring up Malifaux in all cases because I'm just besotted with it. But one of the things that I adored about the first edition of Malifaux, and I found very, very, very inspirational as a model maker, even before even setting aside the playing of the game, there's a system that they provide in the back of the book for generating what your table is going to be, and it's a totally ludicrous system, because what it basically asks you to do is flip out some cards and then decide to set up either like the inside of a theater or like some kind of giant swamp with huge stone circles in it. It's like, I don't have all the terrain just lying around for 52 incredibly unique areas. But what it does achieve instead of that is you look at that and go, wow, I want to make a library. A library would be amazing. I wonder how I'd make a library. Or just like some other kind of, because that game was trying to take you out of, you're just shooting in a Wild West town and you've got some rocks and some buildings. By providing a essentially unworkably complicated terrain generation system, or like table generation system, I guess in some ways, it actually provided way more inspiration from a hobby and model making point of view than Gasland saying set up a broken wasteland.
I mean, we might actually come back to this when we talk about the slightly more out the box versions of deployment zones. But one of my favorite rules for deployment is in Malifaux. There's the parlay scenario where I don't know if you've ever played it. You deploy by playing cards face down onto the table, and then you have to put your people onto those cards. So the deployment is totally mixed up and integrated and not at all split out. And then you have to deal with the way you've been set up like that. And I remember reading that and thinking it's genius, and it's a really sort of brave game design thing to do, to put that
it's called blind deployment, and in second edition it flips out on a joker, and I've played it a few times and I'm pretty sure that's why Billion Suns is the way it is. Because with that deployment, we were probably going off topic, with that deployment it's not fair, but it's extremely story rich, and sort of stories leap out very early on. But I guess back to that phrase out of the box, and the question of terrain and table setup and maybe the barriers to that. There are, I think, some games that have done quite a nice job of establishing a norm for what a table looks like through paper terrain. So both Infinity and Drop Zone Commander both provided very inexpensive cardboard terrain in the box, which sort of gave you a stable of stuff and described roughly the area it was supposed to cover. So you set all that stuff out and you went, oh, right, well, that's what a Drop Zone Commander table looks like then. Fine. And I can then replace that with, sturdier, more beautiful models if I want. And in Infinity, of course, it really mattered, because if you have any sort of coherent sightlines in Infinity, the game is over rather quickly.
So should we sort of round that up by saying terrain setup, a picture speaks 1,000 words. Don't be overly strict on how people set up their terrain, because they're going to have a random collection of things of different heights and sizes, and they're the best judges. And maybe let people figure it out after a few playthroughs.
I think, because I think the most critical thing is how dense is the terrain, and that appears to be best told in a photo.
Cool. So once obviously people have got the terrain on the table, there is a deployment phase. So for anybody who doesn't know, if you're not wildly familiar with these sorts of games, Generally, in a miniatures game of the kind we're talking about, you spend a little while gathering your forces, picking them from army lists, wherever it happens to be. You set up a table, and then you've got to get the models onto the table before they can start blowing each other to tiny, tiny pieces. And the part of the rules that gets models from table into a game zone, makes them into units, makes them into active parts of a game. It defines what they are and what their relationships are with each other at that point, is the deployment phase. So I think one of the things about the deployment phase that's interesting, as we were sort of talking about before, is that it's a heavy front loading of information for a player, for a game system. It's probably the single most important phase of any given game. If most games are decided in the movement phase, if a lot of games have a rock paper scissors relationship between certain units, if in the deployment phase you face the wrong unit off against the wrong unit, you're never going to get it across the table to the right unit. Giving players the information before they've ever played a single game of how best to deploy the unit, so that they just don't get squashed because they failed one single phase that isn't even it doesn't exactly flag itself up as the fireworks factory of most games, the deployment zone. It's not a sort of
right. Get your toys out on the table. Let's crack on to the fun part of the game, which is the shooting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. It's interesting. So I totally agree. For many games, the deployment phase defines the unfolding game, and we'll get into why I design against that later. But it's certainly true for sort of more lumbering games like Star Wars Armada or Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I think it's less true for smaller table, faster, freer movement games like like Infinity, where you can activate a unit multiple times, and if you need to close a distance, you really can. I think that does obviate the deployment zone being a surprise package of, haha, you didn't know how this game works, and now you're in totally the wrong place. I do think it depends a little bit on the game, but I agree with your premise there, which is you don't necessarily, and I certainly, for almost my entire career of playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle, never really gave enough thought to the deployment zone as really the root cause of all of the potential failures that would then happen later in the game. And so working backwards from sort of turn 3 to where you are putting your units so that they're going to be able to get to the place that you get to is it's a tactical element, but it doesn't signpost itself very well.
Yeah, I think there's a line somewhere between a game that moves maybe quite as fast as Infinity and a game that maintains battle lines as solidly as something like Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I mean, something like Malifaux is another good example where how you deploy your own side and you get your auras covering your own models. You're maybe less reactive, but it's still your deployment phase and getting the right runners on the right areas and the right objective claimers to sort of be able to do the correct things.
The inch perfect movement in that game is often so critical that a misdeployment can cost you victory points later because you didn't get the 1 inch you needed into the other side of the board or what have
you. So I would say in general terms, there is let's call it a standard rules of deployment in miniatures games. Generally,
those standard rules of deployment.
We'll move on to your personal war against.
Yeah, so I think you actually have to step back one step, and this becomes obvious later in the conversation. But before you deploy your models and define your deployment zones, before you even put the terrain down, there is a sort of unwritten assumption in quite a lot of games, like you are playing on a square table or an evenly shaped table. And so I think it isn't always true, but I think most games will tell you what size of game these days. Most games will tell you what size of table they are intending that you play on. And if you don't say it in your rule book, it'll be one of the third questions that's asked in your Facebook group. So having defined that, you've got some edges of your table, and from those edges of your and corners of your table, you've got obvious places where things can arrive from the hills or the forest or whatever's off the edge of the table. And so I think like deployment zones do a couple of things. One is that they kick the narrative off for the engagement, whatever the engagement is. And that's why I think the blind deployment that we talked about from Malifaux is so interesting, because it literally throws the cards up in the air and says, what if this engagement started another way? And I think that the way that deployment zones are opposite sides of a table along that whole edge is just, for me, it's just a really it's a really historical war games based system where, the Celts would march in on one side and their opponents would march in on the other because they'd come down a hill or they'd come from their village or whatnot. And so even in modern settings, like, we're defending this part of the urban city, you're aggressing from another area. Like, I think that's the first part, is it defines this sort of narrative space of there is a conflict with two sides. And then the fact that you enforce distance between the units on the first turn creates a narrative space. It creates a tension. It creates a narrative beat at the beginning where there's a approach before the full-blooded combat begins. And again, I'm not necessarily particularly enamored by that, but I can understand that there's a narrative beat there which you can choose to remove and for well thought out reasons, but it is there because it's the John Woo staring of the eyes before they start fighting.
Yeah. So I think there's a let's call them a set of assumptions for deployment zones, where it's something on the lines of your table will be square or maybe rectangular. You'll have two sides of the table. You'll deploy your forces within a certain distance of one of the sides. Your opponent would deploy their forces within the same distance of their side. And that's what I'd call a standard set of deployment rules. And I think where games start to muck around with that, and where that starts to break down, I think starts to be a sort of a series of interesting questions. Because one of the obvious things that then very quickly can't handle is a number of players other than two. I mean, the number of club nights I've gone to where it's been, well, let's play teams, because you have to set up on opposite sides of the table, and therefore everyone has to be grouped on one side of the table or another.
And in particular, it doesn't solve for 3 players. 3 is an ugly number for most deployment systems.
Yeah, solving for 3 is, I think, a big issue for traditional deployment, standard deployment zones. So I think
that is genuinely why my game designs all attempts to do something different, is because we've played enough games of, for example, Triumph and Treachery was something we played a lot of when there were an odd number of players down the club, because it sort of works. But the one thing that definitely doesn't work is deployment, and somebody always ends up being piggy in the middle. And then a bunch of slightly ugly questions get asked about, why are we ganging up on the person in the middle? Well, they're the nearest, and and all that's sort of rooted in just purely the deployment zone definition, no more than that. And
absolutely.
Bad play experiences just because you haven't provided a better system.
Yeah, absolutely. And figuring out a way to deal with the piggy in the middle situation on any sort of 3-player oppositional game, and the way that it gets so heavily entrenched once you've got deployment zones where 2 players are closer to one person than each other, or just even if you're equidistant, 2 people just turn their entire armies in one direction because they know that they'll have an easier time just tearing one person to pieces. It's not always something personal. It's just, okay, well, they moved first and they went in that direction, so I'm going in that direction, and that's just how that works.
I mean, there's a question there about how your deployment rules interact with your objective rules, because I think one thing that's intriguing is the magnetic force of your game between units and enemy units, or between units and objectives. And I know that might be a scenario specific question, but I do think it's quite a core game design question if you're not just attempting to design a combat system with some scenarios.
So once you've got your deployment zones, you obviously put your forces onto the table. Two obvious versions of getting that done is either take a single unit or a single model each one at a time, or take turns sticking your entire forces down. There are variations. Blind deployment. I've seen some games played where people put big old shields between the two sides of the table and everything gets deployed, or writing things out on little note cards to set out what is where, and then deploying it to get away with blind deployment. I mean, I think one thing at a time each is the more usual, probably across most miniatures games, just because it gives you that opportunity to react to what the other person's doing. But one of the talking about Triumph of Treachery, going back a little bit further to the Sigmar end of Warhammer campaign, where you had I was playing massive sort of 10-15,000 point games, and doing one unit at a time took solidly as long as most normal games of Warhammer would take. And I think there's a lot to be said sometimes for side versus side deployment, just to cut through that sort of
certainly when we used to play big Saturday games of Warhammer, like we would start putting units down, and then about 5 or 10 minutes in, everyone would just go, well, whatever, we'll just put everything else down. It's just a bunch of giant rats now. We'll just put all those down. It's fine.
Just stick it all down. So I think if I was going to say something about the standards of deployment in miniatures games, the main thing I would say to people is, don't just take the standard deployment phase rules and think a little bit about maybe why it is that you're suggesting a certain deployment phase. There are pros and cons. There are good things about the standard deployment phase system. Everybody knows it. It's very familiar. I mean, we might talk a bit more in relation to that when we talk about some of the more weird and wild deployment phases. But there are good things. It's quick, it's obvious. It sets up a very clear, chunky narrative of, I turn up on just over this hill, you turn up over that hill. We know that the no man's land between us is going to become a meat grinder of death and destruction, and we have this moment before feeling the dawn on our faces for the last time, and then running in and slamming into each other. But I think I would suggest that people stop and think about the problems that system can create, and question, just if you question it and decide it's right for you, that's great, go with it. And I think this will be, if we ever come up with a set of rules, it's don't take things on just because that's what everything else does. There shouldn't be any standards in your miniatures game design. There shouldn't be any presumptions without you thinking about why you're doing them. And I think one of the big things for that is the deployment phase is, don't just write your strips on either side of the table. I go, you go. We're all set up. We now know what we've got to do. Don't assume that. Think a little bit about why you're doing it, and maybe test yourself a little bit with some more peculiar ideas. Maybe the sorts of things that we'll talk about in the next video.
Nice. At some point, we should also do a conversation where we discuss if any of those things, in fact, are unalienable truths of war games. You must play with the table this way up and not that way up. There's going to be a couple, but I don't know what they are.
Well, whether there are some rules that cannot be broken.
Yeah, are there any rules that cannot be broken? All right, that's another topic.
Yeah. The way the table goes, I think we've come as close as we can to breaking that one with A Billion Suns right off the bat.
Right, where someone playing it magnetically on the side of a fridge.
Yeah. Mike shared a fantastic picture with me from, I assume it's from the Facebook group, or is it of someone playing A Billion Sun with magnetic ships on the side of his fridge, which is just can't tell you how much that gladdens our hearts when we saw that. So fantastic. We'll wrap up this video here, and continue the next video talking a bit more about some of the odder deployment phases you can have. We'll hopefully get into really discussing why some of the choices were made for Gaslands and A Billion Suns, because they've got some very peculiar deployment zone choices that have been made. Yeah, we'll run through some of those. So if you're watching on YouTube, wherever you found this, there will be comments. Let us know what you think and what you'd like us to talk about in the future. If you're watching this as a video, it is available as a podcast for long painting sessions. If you're on the podcast, check out our faces on YouTube. Reach out to us on Twitter or any other social media. But until next time, it's going to be goodbye for now. Bye.
Bye.